just fight and fight, and all is fair in love and war. Now, I always remind people that the 20th century, which is largely seen as the bloodiest century in world history, was also the most secular century in world history. And the great military leaders, or the leaders of countries that committed so many atrocities, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, and others, of course, weren't not only not religious, were anti-religious. So it's hard to say that religion per se is going to be the source of violence and fundamentalism, but nonetheless, there is this fear. And I want to address some of those questions as we go along today and giving out some principles. So this actually, let me make it a little bit bigger. This topic, we're going to focus in particularly on sieges, because I think as we're going to see, we learn a lot about Jewish ethics with regard to military warfare when it comes to sieges. Also, there's an alleged siege that's going on right now by Israel and Gaza. It's not really a siege. Unfortunately, the defense minister sort of announced it that way, but there's certainly a certain level of a blockade that Israel is imposing, and that's going to raise some questions as we go along. As Rabbi Peltz mentioned, this is the subject of something I've been thinking about for a long time. This is my upcoming book. I put in the chat, the pre-sale just began, actually. The book is in the printers, and please God, I hope it will help clarify some of these issues that we'll be speaking about today. So I want to start with a picture from 1982. This is Beirut. This is Israeli IDF tanks surrounding Beirut and the siege of Beirut. And the reason why I want to start here is because this was the first war where the issue of urban warfare, of asymmetric warfare, that means an army versus a terrorist group, an irregular force, really came up. In Israel's previous wars in 56 and 67 and 73, you more or less had regular armies fighting each other, and the battlefield was more or less distinct from civilian populations. Not fully, of course, there are always civilians involved in one form or another, but it was more distinct. 48 is a little more complex, but in general, 56, 67, 73, we were fighting armies versus armies. And here, in the beginning of what's now known as the First Lebanon War, then it was known as Operation Peace of Galilee. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had for many years already been using their base in Lebanon to terrorize Israeli soldiers and citizens. And Israel had done various operations beforehand, but in June 82, Israel went in full throttle. And by a month later, after some difficult fighting along the way, where urban warfare is already happening, a siege of Beirut takes place. Now, when the siege takes place, initially, by the way, once again, Israel tries to shut off electricity and water, and pressure from the Reagan administration makes them put that back on again, turn it back on again. But what really became interesting is the man on the bottom right, whose name is Rabbi Shlomo Goren. Rabbi Goren then was the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, but he's most famous for being the chief rabbi of the army, right? He's the famous rabbi blowing the shofar, the Western Wall in 1967. And certainly he was in the army for many, many years as a fighter, but then mostly as a chief chaplain. And Rabbi Goren, with a prominent position as a Ashkenazic chief rabbi, drops his own bombshell when he announces that he believes, ethically speaking, in Jewish view, Israel must leave a fourth side open of the siege. That is to say, it cannot hermetically seal the city of Beirut, where all of these terrorists are holed up, thousands, 14,000 terrorists are holed up, and instead it must allow for a one-way exit, right? Meaning it has to allow people to be able to flee. Now, of course, when you allow people to flee, you're going to be allowing non-combatants, civilians to flee, but you're also going to be potentially allowing terrorists to flee, right? In other words, the people you're fighting against. And Rabbi Goren, though, announces that this is a bona fide obligation of Jewish law. And he was criticized by this man, upper right, also a member of the religious Zionist community, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, who is the head rabbi of the Merkaz Harav Yeshiva, a very influential rabbinic seminary. And Rabbi Yisraeli said to Rabbi Goren, "You're totally confused you're totally wrong. This is insane. This is not what the Torah has in mind, and it makes no military sense. Right? If you put a siege, you're undermining the whole purpose of a siege. And that was their debate, which went on in public, actually, as this siege is going around. Now, we'll get back to a little bit about what happened in the end of that story. But what I'm trying to already show you is that the fact that you have this military man who's fairly right-wing on his politics, who's coming out and saying publicly Israel needs to leave open a fourth side, already shows you something a little bit of a complex religious and ethical tradition. Now, we know this complex ethical religious tradition. Famously, when we think of our dream for peace, here's a picture on the side here of the Isaiah wall at the United Nations. Right? And the pasuk, the verse there says, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall now lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It's a very powerful message, of course, arguably the most famous verse in the Jewish Bible. And we should believe in this. This is important. It is always important to believe in the hope for ultimate peace and for peace in the world. One of the things I said actually when I was in New York is Jews must always maintain hope. We've had a very complex and difficult history. Jews must maintain hope. And our messianic vision, part of that is understanding that the rainbow will come out after the flood, right? There is a possibility for a better future, and we should be aspiring for that. That said, it is always important to note when you look in, for example, in the parallel in the book of Micah, where Micha, right, where the same verse appears, in this very same chapter, the prophet also teaches us, for I will give you horns of iron and provide you with hooves of bronze, and you will crush the many people. Meaning, in this very same chapter, when we aspire for a dream for peace and the end of warfare, we do understand that there is a reality where sometimes warfare is necessary, and we're going to have to embrace that phenomenon, not like it, but have to deal with the fact that sometimes this is appropriate and necessary. And when you look in the Bible, when you look at the Tanakh in general, you do see plenty of examples of fighting, starting from the very get-go, right? Last week's Parsha, this past week, Lech Lecha, Abraham is promised. Sorry, there's a noise here, 1 second. It's just the airplanes. The airplanes going all day long, the air fighter jets. So anyway, Abraham, now then Avram is promised that right, the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and like 5 seconds later, his nephew Lot is taken captive, and he has to go and fight for it. Right, he has to go and fight to redeem his nephew, right, from the empires of the area. And so you see right away from the get-go of our story, and certainly elsewhere in the Bible, there are notions of courage, there are notions of when you have to fight a war, the high priest says, go fight, be brave, be strong, don't be in fear. And here we get to the most famous example, which I don't want to focus on, but of wiping out Amalek, right? Blot out the memory of Amalek, this nation which did the worst of war crimes as we left the Egypt and the Exodus. Do not forget. Now, I want to stress here, Amalek is not a model for how we should fight wars today. Amalek doesn't exist anymore. And I think it's very dangerous to use such rhetoric about Amalek and wiping out. We certainly are not interested in fighting in that way and committing genocide, even for a just cause. But it is important to understand that the Bible does recognize that sometimes in life there's good and evil. We have to be careful, of course, how we apply that. But sometimes in life there's good and evil, and sometimes that means it's our duty to rid the world of that evil, which includes sometimes going to war. It's a moral principle. And what I think is most complex and most interesting when I think about Jewish military ethics, and one of the things I'm trying to develop is Jewish military ethics is not surrounded or based upon just one value, right? In other words, we certainly have the value of uprooting evil. We certainly understand that there are times when we're going to need to go to war, but that doesn't mean, right, that's the only value, and we're going to have to be balancing different values. I try to develop here. Let me see if I can show this to you in the book. 9 different values, right? We care about the dignity of mankind. Every person is always remember. By the way, it's so important to remember this now. Gazans were created in the image of God. There's inherent dignity in all of them. We should remember that. That's important. We don't want to illicitly kill people, right? Thou shalt not kill is a big deal. We care a lot about that. We also prefer, of course, individual responsibility. We want to punish only those that are responsible for sinning and harming us, right? But not, right, those who aren't. We have a vision of world peace. This is all very, very important. At the same time, we understand that sometimes warfare is necessary in the pursuit of justice. Warfare, unfortunately, is a collective affair. That's the nature of fighting a war. It's not individuals, but it's groups of people. And we have partiality to our own people. And that's part of the challenge, is that we have a moral obligation to protect ourselves and our people, and do it with bravery and courage, and preserve our honor. And I want to focus on this as we go along. And our honor has 2 elements to it. This is what we might call Kiddush Hashem. On the one hand, we do not want to lose, right? It's a Chilul Hashem to lose to the evildoers of the world, to be downtrodden, to have 1,400 people slaughtered. At the same time, it's also, we want to fight in a way that is ethical, that doesn't, and we don't want to disgrace our reputation. And so we're always going to be holding together these values in many different ways when we think about the questions that we face when we're fighting a just war. And so what I think is really fascinating, I want to show you now, is it's precisely this issue of sieges where this comes up in a very profound way, because sieges is the way of the world, and the way that armies, not just the Israeli army, I mean the Bnei Israel, the Israelite army, but armies around history of warfare have utilized sieges. And it's important to understand why. When you have a fortified city, it's very hard to break that, right? We didn't have airplanes. So how do you defeat that fortified city? Sieges are a very powerful way of doing it. It's also a way of ensuring that your own people are less in danger, but it's not easy, right? It's not easy to maintain a siege for a long time, but that's certainly one of the classic methods of going to war. And we see that right away in the book of Joshua, right? Joshua's multiple times, the city of Jericho, this is a picture, artistic rendition, right, of Ai and other places, and God tells them, be strong and resolute. But here's something really interesting. In the book of Devarim, when we get what's probably one of the most clearest ideas, we start to understand that there are limits to how we fight war. The Torah tells us when you are in war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. Do not destroy its trees. Right? Do not destroy its trees. In other words, the first statement which we're told about the limits of war is precisely in the context of sieges. We understand that this is going to be the way, and it's one of the first things that is told to us. The other thing I think I want to stress here about sieges is sieges. Jews utilize sieges. Joshua did, King David did, later kings did, but Jews suffered greatly under sieges. And both in the first and the second temple, we had a siege on Jerusalem. In fact, the fast day, the 10th of Tevet, which is still commemorated today, is about the day when the siege began. And why do we commemorate a siege? The reason why we commemorate a siege, you might say, what's the point? What we really care about is the destruction of Jerusalem or destruction of the temple. But the siege itself is a time of horror, of hunger, and of suffering. And we see this in the first temple. We see this in the second temple as well. And you recall from Tisha B'Av, right, the way we describe in the book of Lamentations in Eicha, how difficult it was. Little children beg for bread. No one gives them a morsel, right? People can't even recognize each other anymore. They're searching the garbage bins, the refuse heaps to find food. People aren't recognizable anymore, right? They're blacker than soot. And it gets to the point where people say, better off were the slain of the sword than those slain by famine. That is to say, it would be better to be killed early on through a sword than it is to die from a famine. And here we get the horrific description of mothers cooking and eating their own children in order to survive. And so it is a very bitter experience being under siege. It happens in the Second Temple as well. And it's interesting, Josephus, the author, Roman, Jewish trader, Roman historian, who writes about the Second Temple's destruction. So Josephus tells us that when it got so bad and women were eating their children again during the time of the Second Temple, so some of the soldiers were bothered by this, and they brought it to Caesar, and Caesar says to them, listen, I gave them a choice. I offer them peace and surrender. Once they don't take peace and surrender, everything then is their fault. Okay, now let's think about that for a moment, because this is very relevant then and now. Do we believe this to be the case? Do we believe it to be the case that as soon as you finished offering peace and you haven't surrendered, well, all's fair in love and war? Or do we say that there are limits nonetheless, and we still have to care about what happens to the other side, and particularly those who aren't harming or threatening us? So I have in mind what we call today non-combatants, right? But could be called, the old days used to call it women and children. As we saw recently, women are very powerful fighters in IDF, right? So, but we'll call it properly today a non-combatants. Non-combatants, do we still care about it? Or do we say it's not our responsibility anymore? Why is this our bother? And that's exactly what Caesar said. So here comes a couple of very interesting phenomena. The first, and these are two important laws, and as I'm going to argue now, they're related to each other. The first one that developed was also in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, which says that when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. Meaning there's an obligation to say before we attack, a la Caesar, let's think about beforehand, right? We offer terms of peace and surrender, which Maimonides brings down in his books of laws of kings and wars. And this is normative law. We always offer a peace agreement first. Where did that come from? It's not so clear in the Bible this should always be offered. And the Midrash tells us a very interesting conversation between Moshe Rabbeinu, between Moses and God. And God says to Moshe, you shall utterly destroy them, right? Destroy that, whoever you're fighting. And Moshe says back to him, wait a minute, how can I go and smite them? I do not know who has sinned and who has not sinned. What does Moses say? I don't want to kill everyone when there are those who have not sinned against me. So what does God respond? He could have said, you shall utterly destroy them. But now that you say this, Moshe, by your life, just as you have said, so will I do. Meaning Moshe is bothered by this problem and says, I do not want to kill those who are not sinning against me, and therefore let us always offer peace first. But once the war has started, you might say, okay, that's a different business. And certainly you do have those ideas in rabbinic text as well. But here comes a really fascinating teaching of the rabbis in the Midrash on Bamidbar. It's known as the Sifri. And they describe the war against Midian. And in it, they describe, again, they assume that there's a siege, because, again, that is the common way of warfare in those times and in the Bible. And so the first opinion says they surrounded it from four sides. Yeah, that's how they do sieges. But Rabbi Natan, the Tana in the 2nd century CE, says they left a fourth side for them to flee from. In other words, according to the minority opinion here, you have to follow the biblical model, which isn't in the text, but he claims this is what they did. They left a fourth side open for them to flee. And interestingly enough, even though this seems to be the minority opinion, both Maimonides, the Rambam, and Nachmanides, the Ramban, codify this in medieval Jewish law as well. Rambam writes, when a siege is placed around a city to conquer it, it should not be surrounded on all four sides, only on three. Why? A place should be left for the inhabitants to flee and for all those who desire to escape with their lives. As it says in the book of Numbers, and they besieged Midian. And the Rambam says, obviously, it didn't say in the verse, but there's a Masorah, al pi hashmua, according to tradition, he commanded them to arrange the siege as described. So the Rambam codifies this idea. You cannot put a siege on all four sides. Even after, right, they rejected the peace offer, which he mentions beforehand, you have to do, you still cannot impose on all four sides. And Nachmanides, the Ramban, explains a little bit more about this idea. And he says as follows: from this, we learn to act with compassion, even toward our enemies at the time of war. Meaning, what the sages, according to the Ramban, have developed is an idea which says there are limits to how we fight war. And one of those things that we always have to remember is compassion. That is an important principle, even when we're trying to win a war. And then he also notes something very interesting. There's a military advantage to this as well. Because let's think about it for a moment. When you have a city which is entirely surrounded, no one can flee. So is there any reason for someone not to fight? Either they're going to starve to death, right? So if they're going to starve to death, they might as well go down fighting. But if you open up the fourth side, then what happens? Maybe people will say, you know what? I don't want to die in battle right now in this siege. I'm going to run. And so there's both a humanitarian, if you will, understanding to this law, but there is also an element which says that there's a strategic advantage to this idea as well. And some of the commentators note, and I think this is correct, that this idea ultimately comes from this same notion of offering peace first. And then still, even when the peace is rejected, when you've gone to war, you should try to show compassion to the enemies and try to let those who want to flee to be able to flee. Right? Now, let's go back for a minute to what happens in Beirut, because here's a question for you, friends. Rabbi Natan teaches this in the 2nd century CE. Rabbi Natan teaches this after the Bar Kokhba rebellion fails. And he says, leave the fourth side open. How relevant was this in Jewish thought, in Jewish practice, I should say, in the subsequent centuries after Rabbi Natan taught this in the 2nd century? How many times did Jews lay sieges in the subsequent centuries? The Jews did it as Jews. Yeah, not that often. In fact, I don't think they ever did. Right? In other words, this becomes a dormant law for many centuries. And here we go back to 1982. Israel, IDF, has laid a siege on Beirut, and Rabbi Goren, the chief rabbi, says Jewish ethics demand that you leave a fourth side open, a one way, right? But you got to let the non-inhabitants leave. And Rabbi Israeli says, no. This wasn't meant to modified law. This is a teaching. He has all sorts of explanations why he thinks it doesn't apply. So what do you think the IDF did? Did the IDF leave a fourth side open? Or did they follow the advice of Rabbi Israeli and hermetically seal Beirut? The answer? Rabbi Peltz, you want to guess?
I unmuted it, so anybody can yell out. What do you think?
I think they left it.
They left it.
Yeah, they think they left it open. I think they didn't leave it open.
You think they didn't leave it open?
Yeah, that's right.
So your congregants are wise people. What can I tell you? They
Or less ruthless than I am, I guess.
They left it open. They left it open, and it's very significant what happened here, right? That we think about 50 to 75,000 people actually left. Many of whom were non-combatants. Some of them, though, were terrorists. And let's see what ends up happening. Israel has 2-month siege. At the end, there's a negotiation with the American Reagan government sort of pushing us along, and 14,000 PLO terrorists ultimately leave Beirut at the end of the siege. And the interim is believed that 1,000 PLO fighters died and 88 soldiers died. And we believe that 5,000 non-combatants were killed in Beirut, with another 20 to 30,000 wounded, but approximately 100,000. Again, the number is always hard to know exactly, left the city. Now, this is remarkable because if you think about it, right, what ends up happening here is they let these people leave. Now, why did they do it? Two reasons. Again, A, because they did not want non-combatants to be in Beirut when there's going to be bloody urban warfare. They have no reason to want to kill non-combatants. And B, it was a way to get people out, meaning it's a way to encourage on a strategic level. And I think it's important to recognize the following. If you look at the numbers here again, so you could say, whoa, right? That's 5,000 non-combatants killed. That's 5 times the number of PLO fighters. So that might seem like that's very extensive civilian damage. It is extensive civilian damage because civilian damage is collateral damage, right? Unintended damage is going to be extensive in urban warfare when the other side decides to fight behind human shields and with an urban environment. But I want to show you on the left side 2 assessments, not by Jews, not by Israelis, of this war in 1982. Okay? And the first is actually from a member of the Human Rights Committee of the ICRC, who writes about this a few years later and says the following: the Israeli bombardment of Beirut in June and July of 1982 resulted in high civilian casualties. No doubt that's true, but not necessarily excessively so, given the fact that the military targets were placed amongst the civilian population. Meaning, given the fact that Israel had to fight in this situation, because that's where its enemies were fighting from, they actually did a very distinct job in not causing excessive. And this is the term that's known as proportionality. Proportionality means, right, that when you attack, are you causing excessive collateral damage? Doesn't mean extensive. It can be extensive. The question is it excessive? And she writes how this was not excessive. And here on the bottom, I want to show you 2 U.S. writers, historians, military historians with strong military history, who also wrote a book, a full book, very good book, actually, on the First Lebanon War called Flawed Victory. The title tells you a lot about what they think about the war. But one of the things they write is as follows. As military historians, we can think of no war in which greater military advantages were gained in combat in densely populated areas at such a small cost in civilian lives lost and property damage. Meaning, the fact of the matter is Israel managed to gain a lot on the military side with relatively low cost in civilian lives. They can think of no war like it. And this despite the PLO's deliberate emplacement of weapons in civilian communities. Now, Rabbi Gorin felt that this was to the credit of the fourth side rule. Now, of course, it's not just the fourth side rule, but it's to the credit of this notion of saying we want to win, it's important to win, we want to uproot evil, but we should do what we can in order to avoid excessive, right, civilian casualties. And this is a very, very important teaching of Judaism. And this is a very important teaching, I think, that the IDF has been trying to implement since in very difficult circumstances. Now, this is complicated. And I want to give you an example of how complicated it gets. As I mentioned, Yasser Arafat and 14,000 PLO members flee Beirut. They're sent out of the country. But by the end of the next year, they sort of come back into the country. And so in 1983, Arafat and his terrorists are back in Lebanon, and Israel lays a siege on the city of Tripoli. And there's a question now, once again, what are the rules here? And interestingly enough, Rabbi Gorin says, do not keep the fourth side open. We are not obligated here to let anyone flee. Now everyone says, wait a minute, last year, right, you just got in the whole thing here, right? What's going on? And he seems to give 2 different explanations here. One of which is that in this case, the fourth side was actually being occupied not by the IDF, but by the PLO's enemies. So there are some who, the PLO's rivals, who felt the PLO was being too soft. They also were attacking the PLO. And so Rabbi Gorin said, we're not in charge of all 4 sides here. We don't have that full responsibility. And the second factor I think that drove him is also the fact that we had let them out already in Beirut a year beforehand. And now they came back. Well, you only get that gift once. Right? That's meant for humanitarian reasons. How many times can you give that gift? But I think ultimately what really happens here, Rabbi Goren gets a little bit stuck. And I don't think this is a bona fide rule, the fourth side. I think it's a principle. It's a value that was being taught. And more than the question of sieges and fourth sides on a logistic technical level, like this isn't how you put on tefillin in the morning, right? Or how like you keep Shabbat or make an Eruv. We're trying here to give across here an ethical principle more than the legal law here that's important. And the important here is law here is to understand win well, uproot the evil enemy, but try to have still compassion on those in the enemy territory, even when you're trying to win this war. That, my friends, is a very, very difficult balance. It would be a lot easier to just say, like Caesar, once we offer them to surrender and they don't do that, all's fair. We gave them a warning, all's fair. And it's particularly difficult here because of the fact that we're fighting in urban territories. And it's particularly difficult here as well because of the fact that, quite frankly, our enemies have been using their own population as human shields. That's really difficult. I mean, there are many, many stories of these situations where you go into a house, there's a terrorist who's literally holding up a kid, sometimes his own kid. You shoot. Right? These are difficult questions. One of the biggest debates the Israeli ethicists have had, and are continuing to have, we'll see what happens this time around, is you go into an urban area. There are 3 homes. You know that one of the homes have lethal terrorists there, and 2 other homes have non-combatants. What do? You fight house to house, right, and try to figure out which one has the terrorists and kill them? Or do you stand back, call in the artillery or something else, and bomb all 3 homes and then move on? It's a big debate. Right? You understand you're trying to balance force protection on the one hand, protecting the force, which is a moral obligation. But at the same time, you don't want to kill non-combatants. By the way, Israel, of course, is not the only ones who've had this debate, right? Dilemma. America had in Afghanistan, America had in Iraq, and others as well. And so this is not an easy question to solve and dilemma to solve. And in my own opinion on this issue, and then I'll start to open up for questions, my own opinion is you're not going to come up with a clear formula or solution about exactly how to figure out all these scenarios. It's not possible. And frankly, the people who have to make these decisions, usually right on the run, are lower ranked soldiers, sometimes commanders, who have to make this when there's noise, blood, a lot of uncertainty around them. What we want to do, however, is to train and teach our soldiers to retain these values, to balance these values, and to do the best they can to retain and hold together these values as much as possible. Now, my own feeling on this is that when push comes to shove, when we have to err on a certain side, we have a moral obligation to err on the side of force protection and to err on the side of making sure that we don't lose our own. And this is very critical. And this is a big dispute because there are many, many people out there in the world who feel, no, you have to endanger soldiers to a much greater extent than I think is acceptable. But that's a live debate, a live discussion. But the point I want to emphasize here is that the fact that there's going to be and already has been tragic, sad, terrible collateral damage, meaning the loss of life of Gazans who are non-combatants, who are created in the image of God, like you and me, is sad and terrible and horrific. It does not, however, mean that Israel, the IDF, is acting unethically. Right? Those two aren't the same. Extensive damage, extensive loss of life does not mean there's anything excessive here. They're trying in a very, very difficult scenario to balance these values. And I want to prepare ourselves for some difficult images that are going to be coming out in the next today, tomorrow, the next week, could be the next few months. Who knows what's going to happen with Lebanon and Hezbollah? There's going to be some difficult images to look at, and it's terrible. War is terrible, but it doesn't mean we're not fighting a just and ethical war. And precisely if we're able at least to retain a balance of these values, we'll be in a very good place. And I think this ultimately is the Kiddush Hashem, right? This is a sanctification of the name of God and our national honor, that we're able to try to balance these values in very, very difficult circumstances. Rabbi, I'll open up to questions, if that's good for you.
All right, that's good for me. And thank you so much, Rabbi Brody, for a really excellent
Thank you.
teaching and presentation, Yishakah. So we'll do as we normally do. If you have a question around the room, raise your hand. I'll do it. If you're on Zoom and you have a question, please do the virtual hand raise or raise your hands frantically and we'll find you. And we'll take some questions. Alvin is behind me here.
Yeah. Am I loud enough from here?
Can you hear him okay?
Can you hear me?
A little bit choppy. If you can move forward, that'd be great.
Okay, so when it was before Israel went into Gaza at all, first thing they did is they said the civilians in the north should go down to the south. It seemed like they were following this principle of leaving a way out. Of course, Egypt had blocked the opening to get out of the Gaza Strip completely, but it would sound like or seem like Israel's going to do its military work in the north. Civilians could be in the south and be more safe down there. Of course, that hasn't turned out. Israel has bombed the southern area as well. And of course, immediately the world turns against Israel and says that we're being totally unethical and everything else we're being, they throw everything against us. But what's the rationale for having said move to the south and then seemingly not paying much attention to keeping that secure?
Yeah, so this is known as forewarning. Forewarning is an idea which you're correct, it is certainly in the one of the principles here that comes from this, which says like try to tell people to get out. My understanding, and again here I'm reading the same reports as everyone else is, but my understanding is that the bombing in the north was much more extensive, right? It has been already, and the attacks there have been much more in the south, with the strategy being that it's impossible not to bomb in the south. Let's understand why, because the rockets are being sent also from southern Gaza as well. So if you're going to take out the clear and present dangers that are coming from the south, you're going to have to shoot in the south as well. But as it's already been implemented, the ground invasion certainly has started in northern Gaza. And this is part of that vision, which is to say that, okay, let us try to get as many people out of this situation as possible. Now, as you mentioned, Egypt doesn't want to open their border. They have their own interests and considerations here. And the bigger issue is that Hamas is very much not interested in having non-combatants leave the area because it is to their advantage strategically to have human shields, involuntary or voluntary as it may be, right, in the area. And here then the question becomes as well, at some point, where does the responsibility lie? Now, it's interesting, Israel's not doing carpet bombing in the north, right? Even after those warnings, right? It is actually sending its troop fighting face to face, right? Very much so, partly because that's what's going to be necessary here to kill, but also partly because they do not want to, they want to minimize the number of non-combatants who are being killed. And, that raises a lot of ethical issues in both directions. Right? I mean, there are many Israelis, many parents. Sorry, there's a funeral coming up right now, and I'm getting a lot of questions here because of this soldier. I apologize, I'm getting beeped here. But there are many Israeli soldiers and Israeli parents of Israeli soldiers who feel that Israel needs to do more to protect our soldiers. We can warn and do everything we can, try to create humanitarian corridors, but we need to do that. And others say back, no, we don't want to be fighting this way. We want to fight in a way which you can try to minimize. I think that's a good sign that you have a live debate like that. That means that you have people in Israel who are worrying about those types of issues. But ultimately, again, Israel can do a lot to try its best to minimize the harm to others. We do not control Gaza, though. And it's always going to be the case that defenders have greater control over the territory. And therefore, a certain amount of responsibility at this point shifts to Hamas for all of these civilian casualties.
Thank you. So we'll go to Cindy and then we'll go to Paul online and then back around. So go
Yeah.
ahead, Cindy.
I'm interested in your comment about not using the analogy with Amalek, because what I've heard is that you fight a different war against Amalek than you do against Midian. And what Hamas did on October 7th, at least with me, sounded very much like what we read about Amalek. So why do you say not that that's something we should not do?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Listen, Amalek, Hamas are horrific people. Horrific. The things they did, I mean, the descriptions, like I said, I just came from the base where they've been IDing bodies. It is horrific. It is just horrific. Like things, I hate analogies and comparisons to the Holocaust because I think it cheapens the Holocaust and I don't like doing that. But if we're going to make a comparison, it comes fairly close to some of the actions that are going on here. So what they did was horrific, 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 horrific. I do not think we should fight, though, the same way that we'd fight Amalek, because the way we fight Amalek is not like what I was talking about right now. The way we fight Amalek is just kill everyone. And I don't think that's the way we want to fight. I don't think it's the way our soldiers want to fight. I don't think it's what our values that we believe in. And so it's precisely because I don't believe that I think that we have to deal with this complex situation. But you are correct that the gravity of the evil here certainly should impact our forcefulness and our, I think, fortitude to make sure that we remove this threat. One of the things that we're seeing, and to Israel's credit right now, the people's credit, there's not a lot of blame mongering going on right now. A little bit, but everyone's sort of, we'll wait till after the war for that. But one of the things that's clear is that people underestimated the capabilities of Hamas in a very significant way, and it's serious. But I don't want to fight the same way that we fought Amalek.
Thank you, Paul.
So the presumed extensive civilian casualties as a result of the air war, does this fall into the category, well, it's extensive but not excessive?
I think so. Well, my assumption, which has been the policy of the IDF again since '82 and before that, forget that as well, but particularly in urban warfare, is that the targeting here is of military targets. Okay, now, but we have pretty precise weapons, meaning that we have smart bombs, so to speak. But precise weapons are not pristine, don't create pristine warfare. There are going to be collateral damage in these cases, which we believe at the time when we're shooting is not excessive, given the gravity of who the military advantage of who we're shooting. But we don't always know. We don't have full knowledge of what's going on there. Sometimes unforeseen things happen, mistakes happen as well. But the policy is always to target military targets. That is a crucial rule. We should never be targeting non-combatants only because they're non-combatants. And that's always been the rule of the IDF, and they've stuck to that. That doesn't mean mistakes don't happen or won't happen. I mean, this really came across with the case of the hospital that got bombed. It turned out to be the hospital parking lot. And Hamas and the New York Times initially blamed Israel for it. And as we all know now, it seems to have been a rocket from Islamic Jihad. But let us say, accidentally, unintentionally, an Israeli rocket had hit that hospital. That accidents do happen and can happen. And that's part of the tragedy of this situation and part of the difficulty of fighting a war and a just war in an urban setting. It's well documented from previous wars, and it's certainly going on now, where Hamas fights and shoots rockets that are killing Israelis, right, from areas that are right next to schools and mosques and hospitals and other protected territories. You should know that under international law, an area that has been being used for military purposes loses its protected status. There's a reason for that. But Israel doesn't want to shoot those places anyway. And it's really difficult. We had it in the previous times, and we have it now as well. It seems Hamas leaders are hiding in bunkers under hospitals. What do you do about that? How do you win a war like that? Right. So this is partly the balance that we're doing. So it's my belief that there's extensive but not excessive damage. But that doesn't mean it's not tragic. It's tragic, friends. It is tragic. We should recognize it's tragic.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll do Jerry in the room and then go to Gary on the Zoom. Go ahead, Jerry.
Rabbi, you know, if you are committed to watching MSNBC all the time here in the States, you would suggest that, well, this is Netanyahu's fault because he surrounded himself with idiots that would just go along with him and the way he wanted to approach things. And that it was because of this lack of, shall we say, professionalism at the top that allowed Hamas to do this. Nobody's blaming the IDF. As a matter of fact, MSNBC thinks very highly of the IDF as far as their competency and their abilities. What's likely to happen? I know he doesn't want to talk about it now because, you know, let's talk about it after this is over. But how is the feeling inside Israel with regard to Netanyahu and what he is doing even now?
So I'd say the following. There's a feeling that the screw up, for lack of a better term, the mechdal in Hebrew they put it as, right? The mistake was of an enormous character that goes beyond, well, one figure or one body. I mean, the enormity of the mistake that happened here, that clearly was being planned for multiple years, as conceptually Israel wasn't prepared for, goes well beyond Benjamin Netanyahu, and I think everyone understands that here. And this is an intelligence failure. There's an army failure. You know, there's certainly a political failure as well. And this has went on for a long time. And so, you know, the question of, I think that is sort of one of the things that's going, you know, that's part of why the blame game isn't happening, is that there's plenty of blame to go around here as well. I think many people here feel that the way Israel has run over the last year and the internal divisions that were caused did not help, to put it mildly, in allowing this to happen, and in some way, form or another contributed to us being caught surprised and unprepared in this way. Again, it's an open question exactly how much that impacted things. And, you know, there have been some interesting news reports on that. But I think by and large, Israelis really want to focus on being united right now and figuring out how we can win this situation. When the war is over, and it could be a while because it could be Hezbollah, it could be a lot of things going on. But when the war does end, it is not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty here politically because there's a lot of anger. And in my city alone, Modi'in, there are 14 Shivas after October 7th. I just try to conceptualize that, right? 14 Shivas. And I paid a number of Shiva calls there, and you talk to people who lost their son or daughter in battle, and there's a lot of anger. A lot of anger. Right? How did this happen? I mean, literally today, I heard someone speaking whose son was taken captive at 9:05 near Kfar Aza. It's about 2.5 hours after the battle started. He was in tank commander. And his next son gets there 4 hours later and gets shot. Thankfully, the second son is recovered. He actually even got married last week. It's pretty remarkable. And the first son, though, is missing in action and presumed kidnapped in Gaza. 4 hours happened between those times. How does that happen? Like, where is everyone? So there's a lot of really, really difficult questions are going to have to ask here. There's going to be a lot of blame to go around. And we'll deal with it when we have to deal with it. I don't think, though, this is only going to be about Benjamin Netanyahu.
All right, so our last question will be Gary.
Yes, Rabbi Brody, we've spent the last hour talking about the ethics of what Israel is doing, and it's great that we're doing that. When are we going to convince people who are pro-Palestinian that they need to be doing the same thing? And the reality isn't so much because it's right or wrong for Israel, but if they really sincerely care about improving the lives of the Palestinians, and they got to look at it from that perspective too. I mean, when are they going to when are they going to start encouraging the Palestinians and pro-Palestinians? Enough of Hamas already, enough of Hezbollah. You know, if they want Palestinians to live in dignity, they have to treat the Israelis with some dignity, and it's a two-way street.
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. Meaning, it is the question in some ways, and I'll tell you why. It's actually a very significant question. President Biden, who, by the way, is very much beloved in Israel right now, on the right and the left. And we'll see how long it lasts, but right now, he's very much beloved in Israel. There's a little bit of a fear that his big hugs can become a bear hug, so to speak, and limit us later on. But right now, kol hakavod to him. And so President Biden has sort of taken a line of saying we need to separate Hamas from the Palestinian people because the Palestinian people don't actually support Hamas in these tactics. I hope he's right. But, you know, we don't really know that for sure. It's really hard to know that for sure. And that's a big question that we're going to have to deal with because we have to figure out what are we dealing with here? What's the end game here? Right? What's the next stage? Which is precisely, by the way, what people like President Biden have been saying and others, you know, where's the political end game here afterwards? And so one of the open questions is what do the Palestinian people actually think, particularly those in Gaza? And of course, following their lead, what do their supporters think in, you know, abroad? I cannot explain. Meaning, I get those who feel the Palestinians are entitled to a state. I get that. I get that. Okay, I'm not going to argue and debate this or that, but I really get that. And there's plenty of Israeli Zionists who believe that as well. It is really, really hard to understand those who justify the actions that they've taken and have been taking, frankly, for many years by Hamas. I mean, the head of the UN sort of is justifying it.
I know.
So that is a very, very, very scary prospect. And I can tell you, I do feel that Israelis have become very hardened to thinking that the world is going to help us here. Despite all of the support we're getting in certain directions, but to solve that larger issue. And so that's why when people like Thomas Friedman write these long articles, you know, what's your end game? Where are you going? You know, where's the political solution here? A lot of people here are saying on the right and the left are saying, in the meantime, I got to deal with this short-term issue. And that is a very, very difficult question. So I wish, Gary, I could give you a better answer, but at least it's an on.
Oh,
I ran out of time.
all right. Well, I was going to thank Rabbi Brody. Now, maybe I'll send him an email, but I'll just say, hopefully he'll click back on in a moment. I'll just, Gary, the one thing I'll just respond to what you said too. Well, I very much feel the frustration that I hear in your. Oh, all right, good. Okay, I thought you'd be back in a second. So I was just saying, responding to Gary quickly. You know, Gary, I feel and I share your frustration with that, and I think also though part of why we have this session and why we have people like Rabbi Brody who are working so hard on these issues and writing about these issues is because that's who we are as a Jewish people, right? We are an ethical people. We care about what we do. We care about our actions in the world. We want to try to do them as best as we can in the world, even in impossible situations like this one. And, you know, I wish everyone else did, and particularly, you know, Hamas and the Palestinians and all those supporters who are around there did as well. But in the meantime, we work on what we can work on, which is trying to educate ourselves to be able to fight the good fight and understand what's going on here. So to that, I want to thank Rabbi Brody very much for his wonderful teaching today. And
thank you so much. And Rabbi Pels, like I said, it really means a lot to me. It means a lot to Israelis, see the support. It's great that you're coming next week. I was just with a rabbinic delegation today as well from America. And I think it's really wonderful. And, I think what you said right now is really important. There's only so much we can control. That which we can control starts with ourselves and our understanding of the issues. And we should try to start with them and then work with others as well, the best we can. And the last thing I just want to mention, and I want to highlight this point because it came up. People ask me a lot of times, what can diaspora Jewry do for Israel right now? What can we contribute to this? So the enormous support has been amazing, whatnot, but I want to keep in mind when this war is over, at some point it will be over. I think the role of the diaspora Jewry is going to be not to get involved in the political fights here. Trust me, we're going to be able to fight very well here on our own. Is to remind Israelis that you got to maintain a sense of unity and you cannot let it get too far. And I think that's a unique role that the diaspora Jewry here can play, and an important one that you can play, because the unity that you're showing us and bringing to us is going to be really necessary later on. And I think that's going to be a very important role that you can hopefully help us with as well. So thank you so much.
Well said. Thank you.
Very
All
Thank
right.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Miles. Stay safe, be well. Love to Rocky. And maybe
Thank
I'll
you
see
so much.
next week.
Love to Rachel. I'm giving you the link to the book if anyone's curious.
Thank
Hopefully be out soon, and I hope to learn with you on another occasion. Be well, everyone.
Right here. All right. Thanks, Miles. Be well. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. More details to come. As you know, I'll be heading to Israel next week. I'll probably have a few other things to share when I come back, and I'll be able to do that. And hope you can follow me there too. And in the meantime, thanks for coming today, and we'll continue to keep doing what we're doing. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining online.
Thank you.
The title of the book